One of my favorite jigs, and also maybe the simplest but also the most controversial jigs I've ever made, is this thin rip jig. It only takes a few minutes to make and allows me to safely cut thin strips repeatedly. There are other ways of cutting thin strips, like using a physical reference placed to the outside of the blade. This is how most woodworkers do it, I would say. But personally, I find it hard to reposition the fence perfectly every time without the wood getting trapped between the fence and the stop. So instead, I designed this simple jig. It's made up of a few scraps, a piece of 3/4 inch plywood to which I'll secure a small block that'll act as a handle. I'll then attach a second piece underneath, flush with the right edge. The key here is that the board that goes on the bottom side needs to be the same thickness as the material you're going to be cutting strips from. It's also best to cut it to a precise width, like say exactly 2 inches or 3 inches. And finally, I'll add a sacrificial heel at the back that'll help hook and push the wood through the blade. Just make sure to keep the screws away from the middle so they aren't in the path of the blade. Okay, that's it. It's ready to use. I'll set my blade height so that the tips of the blade are just barely above the workpiece. And then I'll set the fence to the width of the bottom piece, plus 1/8 or 1/4 or whatever size strip you want to cut. Once I started using this method, I never looked back. I can batch out repeated strips and I feel safe and in control doing it. Just remember though that if you're cutting short strips that could potentially fall into the cracks around the blade, make sure to seal that off with a couple pieces of painter's tape. This next one is a bit sketchy. Using a table saw to cut circles is definitely not the first method I'd choose. But when I put out a video about 4 ways to cut a circle, I just had to try it. The construction is quite simple. Start with a single runner and stick on a plywood base. It should overlap the throat plate, but most of the jig is off to the other side. The runner then gets screwed down from underneath. If the jig slides smoothly, you can go ahead and cut the zero clearance edge. Now draw a line about halfway from front to back, and drill some small pilot holes along the line so you can insert a small pivot pin according to the size circle you want to make. To use the jig, you'll need to drill a small hole into your blank so you can mount it to the pin. There's also a handle for pushing and pulling the sled at the back, but it doesn't need to be square to the jig. Start by cutting the 4 corners off one by one. Now I do want to point out that I did some research before diving into this jig blindly, and I did find some reputable sources that showed how to make and use this jig, so it can be totally safe to cut circles this way as long as you do it right. For example, notice I'm not turning the blank as I go through the blade, just cutting straight through. After progressively cutting off the tips one by one and getting in the shape that's looking pretty close to a circle, the idea is to set up a stop like this mag switch so that the line on the jig lines up with the front gullets in the blade. Then push the jig up against the stop, then rotate the circle clockwise into the blade. It's a bit tricky to find the perfect sweet spot if I'm being honest, and that's one of the reasons I don't love this jig. In fact, I think this is one of the worst table saw jigs I've ever made. There are better ways to cut circles like a router jig or a bandsaw jig, and the table saw ranks dead last in my opinion. So here under my workbench is where I store all of my table saw jigs. And the other day, as I was trying to cram yet another one in here, I realized I've made a lot of jigs over time. Some I use a lot, like my mini Crosscut sled, and others I've used maybe once and probably never will again. And some of them I think I made just to challenge myself, like my Hexagon cutting jig or my Polygon cutting jig. Yeah, we'll talk about those and all 10 of my table saw jigs too. This next jig is one of my favorites. Maybe because, as far as I can tell, I came up with this original sled design all on my own. I wanted to cut small hexagons for a nightstand project, but I needed them to be perfect so they would all match up flawlessly. So of course I knew I needed to build a jig, but I really couldn't find any designs that would allow for repeatable cuts. I finally came up with a first design that worked well, but it was designed to cut one size of hexagon, and the design was very DIY. So I decided to go back to the drawing board and eventually came up with Hexagon Jig 2.0 that has a sliding stop to cut a hexagon any size, big or small. To build it, I started with 2 runners and secured them to a piece of 3/4 inch plywood, first with a little CA glue, then with screws. This is the stuff you'll see me use a lot for the runners when I make table saw sleds. It's sized perfectly to fit the tracks, and it's low friction, so it slides smoothly. After checking that it slid smoothly, I cut the curve, stopping about halfway through. The key is then to secure a fence at exactly 60 degrees, or 120 degrees depending on which side of the blade you're looking at. To help with this, I cut a strip of wood at 60 degrees using the miter gauge. I tacked it down with a couple of brad nails, and checked the angle using a piece of Hexagon tile. It's really important to get this angle dialed in perfectly, so I'd recommend using a digital angle gauge if you have one. Once the fence is screwed down, I'll work on the adjustable stop. For more details about the build, I made a dedicated video about this one and there are plans available too. First I created a shallow track, just deep enough for the T-track, and then glued the track into place. I made the stop block from hardwood, first cutting a groove into the board, then cutting it at the same 60-degree angle on both sides. I drilled a hole right through the center of the groove, and added small pieces of UHMW on each side of the hole. Give it a try, starting with a T-bolt in the track, and then I'll just slide this on top. And these should fit right into that track. And add a washer and a star knob. Lastly, I'll add a block at the back that'll serve as a handle to pull the sled. With this jig, you can cut little hexagons or really big ones. This was the first large one I ever cut using the jig, and as you can tell, I was pretty happy with it. Like a charm. Woo! Now, of course, once I had a hexagon cutting jig, people started asking me if they could use it to cut an octagon or a pentagon. And yes, a jig like this could be built for each of those shapes by changing the angle of the fence and the stop block. But then I thought, what if there were one jig to rule them all? One jig that could cut pentagons, octagons, hexagons, or even triangles. Well, allow me to present the Polygon jig. Yeah, I really didn't know what to call this thing. I guess technically it's a regular Polygon jig, but hey, I'm open to better suggestions. The point is, with this jig, you can cut pretty much any shape and size you want. With the multiple T-tracks, you can set the fences to any angle you want. So you can cut a pentagon, a hexagon, an octagon, and even a dodecadon. But I didn't go that far. Building it starts with the traditional runners and base. And these are the UHMW runners that I mentioned before. I love to use these for all of my sleds because they slide so smoothly and aren't affected by changes in humidity like wood runners are. I'll cut a partial curve just to visualize where the blade will be, and then use my router to make the grooves for the T-tracks. You'll notice that the sled is bigger on one side where most of the tracks sit, and that's because the shapes will always be cut off to the left side of the blade. I cut a slot in the fence at the router table, and it's a good idea to make a few extra ones of these as they'll get chewed up the more you use the jig, so it's good to have some extra on hand. After adding a handle at the back, I'll just drop in the fences using some T-bolts and the jig is ready to use. I like to use a digital protractor for greater accuracy to set the fences. I'll set my first fence and then cut the first reference edge. I can then set the second fence referring off the first one and cut all the other sides by just rotating the blank clockwise. And if you set your fences right, you should end up with a perfect polygon. Call me old school, but I don't own a smartwatch or even a digital watch for that matter. Too many constant distractions. Plus, there's just something about the look and feel of an analog watch that I love, and VAER watches totally gets it. That's why they design an entire line of super sexy watches with interchangeable wrist straps so you can dress them up or down as you choose. They have different sizes that look great for both men and women alike. And the best feature is how rugged and durable these watches are, so I can wear them around the shop without worrying about it, because VAER watches are built to last. My personal favorite is the A12 Dirty Dozen, a true-to-form Swiss-made automatic that pays homage to the field watches designed by 12 Swiss manufacturers for British soldiers during World War II, and came to be known as the Dirty Dozen. These watches were known for their durability, functionality, and precision, and that's exactly what this watch promises. You can check out the Dirty Dozen and all VAER watches today by using the link in description. Believe it or not, I have yet to build a full-size crosscut sled. You know those giant ones that cover your entire table saw? But this mini crosscut sled I love and I use all the time. It's way easier to maneuver and perfect for cutting smaller pieces safely. This T-track at the back allows me to have an adjustable stop block, or I can add a hold-down clamp if I want, or I can add these miter attachments, and this sled can now make 45-degree cuts, which is great for picture frames or trim and so much more. I have a dedicated video in which I make this sled, including the miter attachments, and I'll link it down below. I've also created a playlist that I'll link up that includes all the jigs I cover in this video in more detail if you want to check that out. Plus, I have plans available for most of the jigs I've made, so be sure to check the description for links to those as well. So after securing the runners, I'll attach a short fence at the back so I can then cut out the kerf, but not go all the way through just yet. This is so I can use the kerf as a reference to square up the back fence. I also added the strip that'll hold the T-tracks, and could then get those both squared up together and screw it down from underneath, being careful not to put screws in the groove for the tracks. Finally, I cut all the way through, then added a short piece of T-track on each side. I glued together a quick stop block that I could mount in the track using a T-bolt and a star knob. This jig really comes in handy for a lot of small cuts that I wouldn't necessarily know how to make otherwise, so this one is definitely one of my top favorites. Okay, so when I said I didn't have a full-size crosscut sled, that wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't 100% true either. This may look like a crosscut sled, but it's actually a panel cutting sled. I originally built it when I was making my brick pattern end grain cutting board, and I needed a way to square up the ends of my panel and rip a bunch of even strips. It worked beautifully. Easy cuts with little resistance and no burn marks. I'm totally in love with this jig, mostly because of how easy it was to make. All you need is a plywood base, a runner, and some hardwood for the fence. I always use a few pennies to raise up the runner, and you can see that I've set my fence here just past the blade. I didn't even use any glue here. I just traced a line where the runner is, and screwed down the runner from the top side after drilling some countersink pilot holes first. Cutting a zero clearance edge will allow me to use that edge as a reference to square up the back fence. I had a piece of walnut just the right size, but I realized that's a bit unnecessary for a jig. Any piece of hardwood will do here. I find it easiest to secure one end, then square it up and lock down the other end of the fence, then add a few more screws in between. That's it! It's super easy and works great. Whether you need to square up a panel or make a crosscut, there's so much you can do with this simple jig, and it's much lighter and easier to maneuver than a crosscut sled. This is definitely a jig I wish I had made sooner. You know that rule that says you shouldn't crosscut against the fence? That's one of the reasons we build crosscut sleds. Well, the same applies for making bevel cuts, and that's why I built a 45-degree bevel cutting sled. But I decided to put my own twist on this sled. Instead of making it out of plywood, I used laminated particle board instead. I had a large piece left over, and when I considered it, I could think of a few advantages of using this material. One, it has a super slick surface to help it slide across the table saw surface. And two, it stays dead flat. Unlike plywood that sometimes curls up at the edges. By now you know the drill. A few pennies to raise up the runners so they'll make contact with the base as I temporarily secure it with glue. I can then remove the sled and secure the runners with screws. I'll add a bridge at the front, and this front piece doesn't need to be squared to the blade. And once the bridge is secured, I can set my blade to 45 degrees and cut a partial kerf, stopping just before the edge. For the main fence, I layered 2 pieces of plywood to make a beefy fence that would stay dead flat. There's a dedicated video on my channel for this sled if you want to get all the details, and I'll leave a link to it down below. Not only is it safer to make bevel cuts with the sled, it's also way easier to line up your cuts and even use a stop block for repeated cuts. Plus, you'll get cleaner cuts with less burning. So if you plan to make a mitered cabinet, I highly recommend making this simple sled. While having a large crosscut sled is great for cutting panels, it's not so great for smaller miters like, say, making a small box. That's why I built a mini 45-degree sled with a single runner that's much lighter and easier to maneuver with just one hand. What I love the most about a jig like this is how fast and easy it is to make. I grabbed a small offcut of plywood from my lumber cart and attached a single runner underneath. This is that UHMW, a sort of plastic that I mentioned earlier, that I love to use for runners. At the table saw, I tilted my blade to 45 degrees and cut the edge of the sled. Then all that's left is to attach a back fence. I used a beefy piece of hardwood that I first set with CA glue square to that freshly cut edge of the sled, so I could then flip it over and secure it with screws. Once I trim the back fence, the jig is ready to use. Like I said, it's very easy to make and super easy to slide back and forth with just one hand. It's compact and lightweight. You can clamp a stop block to the fence to make repeatable cuts. And a sled like this is great for making mitered boxes, even really small pieces to make small, delicate boxes. Cutting angles on the table saw can be tricky, and that's where a tapering jig comes in. Whether you want to add a taper to furniture legs or cut an angle, say, for the base of a coat rack, this is the jig you need. And it's not that hard to make. You'll have to forgive the old footage where you can see my humble beginnings. First, I cut a small piece of plywood for the base. Then I used my router to cut a shallow slot just deep enough to countersink the head of a T-bolt, or in this case, a toilet bolt. Then I used a 1/4-inch spiral bit that matched the size of the bolt to cut a slot within the slot. And as you can see, I'm doing this on both sides, stopping short of the edges. Once done, the T-bolt slides smoothly in the slot with the head countersunk below the surface. Next, I made a fence from another piece of plywood the same length but only a few inches wide. I'll use the same 1/4-inch spiral bit to cut a slot on both ends. The length really isn't important here, but you want to make it at least a few inches. Here's a quick shot of the hardware I used, and next I'm going to mount the fence to the base using the bolts, a washer, and a star knob. Then secure the toggle clamp to the fence. The last step is to add a runner underneath. Remember to have the sled overlap the blade slightly when you do this so that you can then trim the base to create a perfectly square zero clearance edge. Back when I made the jig, I added a metal hook at the back, but I've since replaced this with a piece of wood to avoid potentially running the metal through my blade by accident. To use the jig, just line up your markings with the edge of the jig at the front and at the back. Then butt the fence up against your workpiece and lock it all down, both the fence and the toggle clamps to secure the workpiece. And now you can cut repeatable tapers safely on the table saw. This is a great jig that really comes in handy. Last but not least of the table saw jigs I've built over the years is this tenoning jig. But really, I kind of hate that name because I've never actually really used it to cut tenons. It can do so much more than that, like cutting castle joints, or even be modified to cut splines for mitered boxes. The jig is essentially 3 pieces of plywood assembled together to ride along the table saw's fence. Each table saw is different, so you'll need to measure your fence and cut your pieces to fit your situation. The most critical measurement being the width of the fence. I'll first use my countersink bit to drill some pilot holes and then follow that up with screws. You want it to be snug around the fence, but still be able to slide freely. And make sure all the screws are countersunk below the surface. Then, depending on what you want to use the jig for, you can attach different stops to the jig. If you want to cut tenons, for example, you can just secure a piece of wood square to the base like this. Oh yeah, and I like to attach a small block to use as a handle. Totally optional, but I find the jig easier to use this way. Then grab your workpiece and butt it up against the stop on the jig and clamp it down securely. With this jig, you can cut tenons, hence the name tenoning jig, but also so many more types of joints too. The trick to using this jig is to always dial in your settings using a test piece first. That way you'll always get the perfect fit for every joint you cut. So that about covers it, all 10 table saw jigs that I've made over the years, and I'm sure there are more to come. Be sure to check the description box below for links to build plans that I've made for most of these jigs, as well as deep dive videos where I go into more details. Until next time, thanks for watching, see you soon.